Robert de La Rochefoucauld came from a French noble family 1,000 years old, grew up in a mansion near the Eiffel Tower, and by 15 had already been patted on the cheek by Adolf Hitler on a school trip to the dictator's own Alpine retreat. Within a few years, the same young man would be trained by the same secret British unit that inspired James Bond, parachuted twice into occupied France to blow things up for a living, sentenced to death by the Nazis on 2 separate occasions, and would escape both times, once by stealing a Nazi officer's own car, and once disguised as a Catholic nun. It's one of the most cinematic personal stories to come out of the entire Second World War. It's also, in places, a story historians have since found genuine reason to seriously question, not as a matter of casual suspicion, but based on specific documented conflicts between his own account and the wartime archival record. Everything that follows draws on his own 2002 memoir, contemporary obituaries in outlets like The Telegraph, The Independent, and The New York Times, and, importantly, Paul Kicks's 2017 biography, The Saboteur, and the archival research behind it, which uncovered real discrepancies between La Rochefoucauld's own account and the documented historical record. I'll flag those discrepancies as they come up, rather than presenting every detail as settled fact. Robert Guy Jean-Marie de La Rochefoucauld was born September 16, 1923, in Paris, one of 10 children in a family, descended from centuries of French nobility, a line that includes the 17th century writer François de La Rochefoucauld, still studied today for his collection of moral maxims. While most of France spent the interwar years recovering from a war that had killed roughly 1/5 of the country's young and middle-aged men, young Robert grew up shuttled between a Parisian mansion and his grandmother's chateau, educated at private schools in Switzerland and Austria, fluent in multiple languages by his teens. His parents, by multiple accounts, raised their children with a pointed dislike of Germany specifically, a household where German-made goods were simply not welcome, and where the language itself was reportedly considered something close to improper, to even practice, sentiments only reinforced by his father's own lingering injuries from the First World War. When Germany invaded France in 1940, Robert was 16 and already an ardent follower of Charles de Gaulle, the exiled general broadcasting daily from London, urging the French to keep fighting rather than accept defeat as final. His own father, a decorated veteran of the First World War, was taken prisoner by the occupying Germans almost immediately, and the family's Paris home was subsequently requisitioned to billet German officers alongside them, an arrangement that, by every account, made an already resentful teenager considerably angrier over the following years. 2 years later, in 1942, word reached Robert that he'd been denounced to the Gestapo. With resistance help, he adopted a false identity and fled toward Spain, escaping alongside 2 downed British airmen who'd also been hidden by the French underground. Spanish authorities under Franco intercepted all 3 men and interned them at the Miranda de Ebro camp, a facility used throughout the war to hold foreign nationals and refugees crossing the Pyrenees, and one with its own grim reputation for harsh conditions. La Rochefoucauld talked his way past his captors by passing himself off as English, and was eventually handed over to the British Embassy during an organized prisoner evacuation. The British were impressed enough by his resourcefulness that they recruited him directly into the Special Operations Executive, the clandestine sabotage organization Winston Churchill had ordered to set Europe ablaze, later nicknamed the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. Before committing, Robert reportedly sought out Charles de Gaulle himself to ask permission. De Gaulle's response, by La Rochefoucauld's own account, was simple: If it is for France, then go ahead. Flown to London, Robert went through the SOE's brutal training pipeline: parachute jumps, demolitions, and hand-to-hand combat instruction from men like Eric Sykes and William Fairbairn, veterans whose so-called gutter fighting system was built from Fairbairn's own years, surviving as a police officer in one of the most violent cities on earth, pre-war Shanghai, where he reportedly survived being stabbed a dozen times in a single gang attack before dedicating himself to mastering every close combat discipline he could find. Trainees were sorted by aptitude into rough specialties: agents, wireless operators, and saboteurs, and the demolitions instruction Robert received went well beyond simply learning to build a bomb. Identifying which structural points on a bridge would collapse the whole span, which factory components were hardest to replace, and why targeting the transformers feeding a power line mattered more than the line itself. In June 1943, not yet 20 years old, La Rochefoucauld parachuted into occupied France for the first time, tasked with training resistance fighters and carrying out sabotage missions of his own. His documented actions from this period include destroying an electrical substation and demolishing railway lines near the town of Avalon. That November, he was captured by German forces, tried, and sentenced to death. While being transported for execution, La Rochefoucauld jumped from the back of the moving truck, dodged gunfire from the guards, and fled through unfamiliar streets, eventually finding himself, almost by accident, right outside a German headquarters building, precisely the last place a fleeing man wanted to end up. Rather than turn and risk drawing attention, he reportedly walked calmly past the building itself. Spotting an unattended official limousine parked at the gate, its swastika pennant flying, and the keys still in the ignition, while the driver stood chatting a short distance away, he simply got in and drove away. He abandoned the stolen car once it started failing after a chase and several checkpoint close calls, caught a train toward Paris, and reportedly spent much of the journey hiding in a bathroom to avoid a document check he wasn't confident his forged papers would survive. When we arrived in Paris, he later told the Telegraph, I felt drunk with freedom. SOE arranged his evacuation back to Britain not long afterward, though, as noted, the specific means of that extraction, which La Rochefoucauld's memoir places near Calais by submarine, doesn't match any documented SOE sea operation in that area during the relevant period. Kicks's research instead points to a different vessel and a different stretch of coastline entirely. In May 1944, La Rochefoucauld parachuted back into France a second time, operating under the code name Sun. According to his own account, disguised as an ordinary factory worker, he spent days smuggling roughly 40 kilograms of plastic explosive into a massive German munitions plant at Saint-Médard-en-Jalles, near Bordeaux, reportedly hidden inside hollowed-out loaves of bread and specially modified shoes, before detonating the charges on May 20th and escaping over a wall on a bicycle. The message he claims to have sent back to London afterward got a single word in reply: Félicitations. Here's where the story runs into a real problem. Independent researchers digging through wartime archives for Kicks's biography found that this exact target had already been struck 3 weeks earlier by RAF Bomber Command, on the night of April 29th and 30th, 1944, an attack the Times described at the time as producing unusually spectacular results, including explosions heard half an hour after the bombing run had ended. RAF photo reconnaissance afterward confirmed the plant was heavily damaged, with multiple large warehouses destroyed and the rail line into the site severed at several points, craters 90 feet across, clearly visible from the air. If the plant had already been that badly wrecked from the sky 3 weeks before La Rochefoucauld says he snuck explosive-packed bread loaves through its front gate, the timeline of his own account becomes difficult to reconcile with what the RAF's own contemporary damage assessment described. SOE's own detailed internal report on its French sabotage operations, filed in 1946, makes no mention of La Rochefoucauld at all, though it does contain one intriguing line crediting a different resistance group, Corps Franc-Georges, with an attack that put the same plant out of action 15 days. Whether La Rochefoucauld's account describes a real action misattributed to himself, an exaggeration of a smaller role in someone else's operation, or something else entirely, isn't something the historical record settles cleanly. It's not the only detail historians have flagged. La Rochefoucauld's memoir describes being recruited in Spain by an SOE officer named Eric Piquet-Wix in late 1942. But archival personnel records show Piquet-Wix didn't actually arrive in Spain until 1944, having spent much of the intervening period recovering from tuberculosis before taking up a junior post in Madrid. Kix's research instead suggests La Rochefoucauld met with the British ambassador in Spain first, and only encountered Piquet-Wix later, in London. His memoir also describes being extracted from France by submarine off the coast near Calais, at a time when official SOE records show no sea operations were being run anywhere near that stretch of coastline at all. His name, in fact, doesn't appear anywhere in the standard official history of SOE's French operations, though that gap is genuinely complicated by the fact that roughly 7/8 of SOE's own wartime records were lost to a fire and later archival trimming, and by the fact that La Rochefoucauld worked with a different, less documented branch of SOE than the one that official history primarily covers. What isn't in serious dispute is that La Rochefoucauld was captured again not long after, this time held at Fort du Hat prison in Bordeaux, a facility with its own grim wartime reputation as a holding site for resistance prisoners awaiting interrogation or transport to concentration camps in Germany. According to his account, he feigned an epileptic seizure in his cell, and when a guard came in to check on him, struck the man with a table leg and broke his neck. He took the dead guard's uniform and pistol, shot 2 more guards during his escape through the facility, and got out of the prison entirely, needing somewhere to disappear immediately, with wanted posters bearing a sketch of his face already circulating through the city. He contacted a resistance sympathizer whose sister happened to be a nun, borrowed her habit, and reportedly walked calmly through occupied Bordeaux dressed as a nun, to reach a senior agent's safe house without a single German soldier giving him a second look. With D-Day approaching, La Rochefoucauld chose to stay in France rather than be extracted again, carrying out what his own account describes as dozens of additional sabotage and intelligence missions through the Normandy campaign, as Allied forces pushed steadily east toward the German border. During one of these operations, he was captured by the SS and brought to a field for summary execution by firing squad, only for resistance fighters to neutralize the execution squad's machine guns just in time, buying him the chance to escape yet again. His final mission behind enemy lines came in April 1945, a night raid against a fortified German gun position, a casemate guarding the mouth of the Gironde estuary near Saint-Vivien-de-Médoc, part of the coastal defenses protecting a German-held U-boat base the Allies badly wanted shut down before the war's final push into Germany. These Atlantic coastal pockets, bypassed and left to wither as Allied forces raced toward Berlin, remained some of the last organized German positions still fighting on French soil this late in the war. Paddling up the river under cover of darkness, La Rochefoucauld and his team reportedly killed a sentry guarding the position and destroyed the casemate with explosives, helping force the remaining German defenders back to their final fallback position further down the coast. Shortly afterward, a landmine explosion during the broader assault badly injured his knee, sidelining him for the war's final weeks and requiring a prosthetic replacement for part of the joint. After Germany's surrender, La Rochefoucauld made his way to occupied Berlin, where by his own account he was greeted and kissed directly on the mouth by Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov, then commander of the Soviet occupation zone, who'd apparently misheard his unusual French name as La Rochefoucauld, and greeted him accordingly, mistaking him for some distant Slavic relation rather than a French count. It's exactly the kind of small, absurd, unverifiable anecdote that populates the back half of his memoir, charming regardless of whether it happened precisely as told. Post-war, with the SOE disbanded in 1946, La Rochefoucauld remained a French military officer for years afterward, training troops and conducting operations against the Viet Minh during France's long, losing war in Indochina, and later taking part in the 1956 Suez Crisis, alongside British and Israeli forces against Egypt, a conflict that, unlike his wartime service, ended in humiliating diplomatic retreat for all three nations involved, once the United States and Soviet Union both pressured them to withdraw. It's a reminder that even a genuinely accomplished wartime record doesn't guarantee every subsequent chapter of a soldier's career ends in the same kind of clear-cut success. For his wartime service specifically, he was ultimately made a Knight of the Legion of Honor and awarded France's Croix de Guerre and Médaille de la Résistance, along with Britain's Distinguished Service Order and Distinguished Conduct Medal. He settled eventually into an entirely different kind of public life, serving as mayor of the small Loire Valley canal town of Ouzouer-sur-Trézée for 30 consecutive years, from 1966 to 1996, a remarkably long, quiet civic career for a man whose 20s had involved multiple death sentences. He married Bernadette de Marcieux de Gontaut-Biron, and the couple raised 4 children together. In 2002, he published his memoir, La liberté, c'est mon plaisir. Freedom is my pleasure, the primary source for most of the dramatic wartime episodes that later made him famous, both in France and, after Paul Kicks's English-language biography arrived in 2017, to an American readership as well. Kicks's book became a genuine commercial success, drawing serious historical research to verify what it could, and, in the process, surfacing the very discrepancies described above, a rare case of a popular biography being rigorous enough to complicate its own subject's most cherished stories, rather than simply repeating them. One further chapter of his life sits uneasily alongside the rest of it, and deserves honest mention rather than quiet omission. In 1997, La Rochefoucauld testified as a character witness for Maurice Papon, a former Vichy government official standing trial in France for having overseen the deportation of some 1,600 French Jews to Nazi concentration camps during the war, one of the most significant war crimes trials France conducted in the decades after 1945. La Rochefoucauld told the court that Papon had, in fact, quietly assisted the resistance and the Allies at real personal risk during the occupation, and that this side of the man deserved to be weighed alongside the deportations. Papon was convicted anyway, of complicity in crimes against humanity, and sentenced to a lengthy prison term. While appealing that sentence, Papon fled France for Switzerland, and was eventually arrested at a hotel in the resort town of Gerstad, where he had checked in under the name Robert Rochefoucauld. One of Papon's own defense lawyers later stated publicly that La Rochefoucauld had lent Papon his own passport, specifically to help him leave the country undetected. Papon died in 2007, having served several years in prison before his release on medical grounds. Robert de La Rochefoucauld died on May 8, 2012, in Ouzouer-sur-Trézée, at 88 years old. News of his death was first reported by his family in the French newspaper Le Figaro, with British obituaries following weeks later. Whatever the precise, disputed details of any single mission, the broad shape of his life is not in question. A teenage French aristocrat who genuinely fled occupation, trained with Britain's most unconventional wartime unit, was sentenced to death by the Nazis more than once, and escaped every single time. It's worth saying plainly that this kind of uncertainty isn't unique to La Rochefoucauld, or even unusual for SOE veterans generally. The organization itself operated with almost no official oversight and deliberately kept minimal paperwork by design. Its own archives were later gutted by fire and post-war record trimming, and many surviving agents only told their stories decades later, filtered through memory, age, and the natural pull toward a better story than the messier truth might have been. That doesn't make La Rochefoucauld a fraud. It makes him a case study in exactly how difficult it is to fully verify even a genuinely heroic life when so much of the documentary record it depends on simply didn't survive the war that created it. Exactly how much of the color in this story is verified history, and how much is a very good story a very charming old man told about himself for 60 years afterward, is something historians are, quite reasonably, still sorting out. What isn't in question is that a boy who watched Nazi soldiers move into his own family's house chose, again and again, at genuine mortal risk, to fight back, and that whatever embellishments crept into the retelling over the decades, the man underneath them really did spend years of his youth trying to burn down an occupying army's ability to keep fighting.